The '07 was a cool, damp vintage. This was the loser vintage of the last decade in Ribera, which only means it was more difficult to make great wine. It doesn't mean anything about the quality of the wines. This is Valdubon, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Emilio Moro produced one of the most beautiful Crianzas out of '07 that I had tasted anywhere, but it was nothing like his normal Crianza, which are also gorgeous, but a completely different character. I like vintage specificity myself. I don't like tasting the same thing year after year after year after year. It makes me wonder about how it was made, because I live on a farm and I know that the climate is never the same from one year to the next. So how come this wine tastes the same year after year after year? Suspicious. Lots of suspicions. '07 was a cool damn vintage, and you taste it in this wine. Now this is a reverse. The last two wines we tasted were about 70-30 French to American. This one is 80-20 American French on the oak.
Is that more traditional?
No, not necessarily. It's usually about, if they're using French and American, it's 50-50. Or a little heavier.
Historically, was American more prevalent at one time?
Yes. American oak was much more prevalent for a couple of reasons. One, it wasn't French. Two, it was cheaper.
Yes. Equally good reasons.
Good reasons.
50-50 in the equation.
Equally good reasons. But there's a lot of French oak coming in now, which is beautiful. Tempranillo loves oak, so it doesn't really matter.
It really does. I mean, it's the modern traditional wine argument falls apart with a couple of grapes, I think. And Tempranillo is one of them that it just has an affinity. And it's interesting because Tempranillo, Cabernet has an affinity for oak as well. But when I think of Tempranillo, I tend to compare it much more to Pinot than to Cabernet. And Pinot's works well with oak as well. But it's very interesting how Tempranillo can suck up oak and remain sort of elegant and light, and yet remain on top of oak, which with Cabernet would be very assertive. I think it's a fascinating interplay. Wine is fascinating. It's a lot of mystery and a lot of who knows what's going on there. But
tasting.
So let's say
if you were taking a Tempranillo, if you tasted a California versus Australia versus Spanish Tempranillo, you would not necessarily know it's the same grape.
I mean, I find I've tasted enough California and Washington State Tempranillo to know that it's not. It's a different wine than what's grown in
even
Spain.
if you vinified it the same
you could do exactly. It's just the soil's different, the sunlight's different, everything's different. And that's somebody, I think Richard before said, yay for vintage variation. I love vintage variation, and this slightly overused term of terroir. But if you don't overdo it, every wine can be so different, and that's the other thing that keeps me in wine. You learn something, but also you can taste two wines from across two vineyards, the same person vinifying them, and they're completely different expressions.
Well, as an example, within La Hora, the village we were talking about, there are a lot of old vineyards, about 100-year-old vineyards. Alto, which is one of the great Ribera vineyards, went into these vineyards, took their clippings, grafted them, and started their own vineyards in their own site while they were buying from this. After about 10 years, the vines all died. And they were like, what happened? Each of those little vineyards had developed its own diseases and its own immunities. And when they were planted together, they killed each other.
Oh, that is sadly funny.
Some of these vineyards, even though the DNA is exact across the board, some of them like to be pruned within an inch of their lives. Some of them want to be left to grow as wild as possible to produce. Each one developed an individual personality, and that's within one tiny little, probably 10-acre plot. So it's impossible to quantify Tempranillo as a blind tasting grape. You will never. I suppose someone somewhere will be able to always pick it out, but I don't think you could pick out Tempranillo. It's certainly not the way you can Nebbiolo or Pinot, which is a much more clear
clearer signature.